Good evening, I'm Andrew Chang.
I'm Adrian Arsenault. Tonight, is politics driving the pandemic response in parts of Canada?
The safety and trust are now broken.
Secret recordings reveal Alberta's top doctor under pressure from the provincial government. The CBC News exclusive.
Ottawa under fire for its vaccine plan.
The question to the minister is simple. On what exact date will the vaccine for Canadians be here?
The plan, the complications, and the timeline at issue weighs in.
He hit me in the chest really hard.
Allegations of officer-on-officer violence. CBC News investigates racism, misogyny, and violence inside Toronto's police service.
And finding new ways to celebrate old traditions.
Have you got a high five for Santa?
This is The National. This pandemic has been going on for 261 days now. Just living through it is so hard, so complicated, so full of details that it can be easy to lose sight of the big picture. But it's really important not to.
People are dying, not sporadically, not sometimes. They are dying by the dozens every single day in this country. If this was a different kind of tragedy, we'd have photos to show you, names to share. There would be shock. Instead, this is how we can show you the horror. One silhouette for each death reported just today, for each family left grieving. There are 89 in all. That's a staggering number that itself seems small when you compare it to this, 11,799, the total number of confirmed Canadian COVID-19 deaths so far.
Some pretty sobering numbers, which could climb much higher. But in the face of those numbers, growing concern tonight that the response to the pandemic is being politicized. Last night, we told you how Ontario's Auditor General criticized the Ford government for not putting health experts in key decision-making roles. Tonight, we turn the focus west with a CBC News exclusive. Audio obtained by CBC suggests division between Alberta's Premier and his Chief Public Health Officer. Jenny Russell broke this story for us.
Based on recommendations from the Chief Medical Officer of Health.
A familiar phrase from Alberta Premier Jason Kenney on Tuesday. When he issued new restrictions, he said based on advice from the province's top doctor. But CBC News has obtained secret recordings from Alberta's COVID-19 Emergency Operations Centre. They reveal Kenney and his cabinet sometimes overruled the advice of Chief Medical Officer Dr. Deena Hinshaw. And they suggest politicians pushed a relaunch strategy more focused on not curtailing Albertans' freedoms than safeguarding public health. For example, on June 9th, hours before Kenney announced the second stage of Alberta's economic relaunch, Hinshaw relayed the political direction she was getting.
Essentially, I think what we're hearing, and we just want to test this with Minister's office, is they don't want us to enforce anything. They want us to educate and no enforcement.
Confidential sources tell CBC News Kenney has set thresholds to introduce new restrictions that are effectively impossible to meet. His top priority, sources say, is the economy.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Opposition NDP leader Rachel Notley says Kenney is micromanaging the pandemic response for his political base and not the broader public.
Kenney's judgment should not be used to replace the science-based recommendations in the majority of cases of our Chief Medical Officer of Health.
She called on Kenney to establish an independent scientific panel to advise the government and make its recommendations public. In the legislature, Kenney made no apologies.
I plead guilty. I have sought evidence and data to inform our challenging public health decisions and ensure that they are taken in a balanced way.
Okay, so Jenny, that's how the Premier responded to your reporting today. What did Dr. Deena Hinshaw say?
Hinshaw said she was profoundly disappointed that recordings of these private meetings were leaked to us.
These meetings should be a safe space where public servants have candid and ongoing conversations and debates. This safety and trust are now broken.
Now, Hinshaw reiterated that Cabinet has always respected her recommendations, and both she and Health Minister Tyler Shandro tried to spin this as a personal attack on her and the officials working on Alberta's pandemic response. Andrew?
Okay, Jenny Russell in Edmonton tonight. Thanks.
For the federal government, it's the COVID vaccine plan that is drawing political fire right now after the revelation that Canada won't be first in line to get the vaccines. But as David Cochrane explains, We did get some details today, including a potential timeline.
Politics boiling over in a pandemic.
Why did the Prime Minister negotiate deals to put Canada at the back of the line for COVID-19 vaccines?
Will she have to stand here in April and apologize to the families of 8,000 dead Canadians?
With the opposition and some premiers painting Canada as unprepared.
We have a lot of questions to ask. When are we getting it? What are we getting?
But a much calmer picture from the experts overseeing the plan.
We expect certain vaccines to become available in early 2021. However, it's important to note that the initial supply of these vaccines will be limited.
Early in 2021 likely means January. Limited means about 6 million doses of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines by the end of March.
We're looking at a population of about 3 million Canadians being sort of at the beginning to be vaccinated.
But all of that depends on regulatory approval. The U.S. and Europe are tracking for December, so is Canada.
We're expecting to make a final decision on the vaccines around the same time as both the U.S. FDA and the European Medicines Agency.
And so the government is buying the freezers, syringes, and swabs to vaccinate a nation, while drug companies seek approvals and try to scale manufacturing to meet insatiable demand. There's a lot to do, a lot can go wrong, so Canada is being less definitive than other countries.
And for people that are saying specific dates, I think that's great that they've got the confidence in those numbers. But from what we're seeing, there really are a lot of moving parts.
So, David, I get the caveat, right? Lots of moving parts. We all understand that. But the bottom line is we all still want to know, when can most Canadians expect to be vaccinated?
Yeah, so everything we can say about this is conditional, right? On the approvals, on manufacturing scaling up properly, and then these delicate substances being delivered and distributed in the middle of a Canadian winter. But the overall plan is to use those initial 6 million doses for high-risk populations and essential workers, get them done first. And the idea then is as that manufacturing scales, shipments will increase throughout the spring and into the summer, and more vaccines hopefully will get approved. And if this all works out, Adrian, the plan is that the majority of Canadians should be vaccinated by next fall, basically by this time next year.
A year. Okay. All right. David Cochran in Ottawa. Thanks, David.
You got it. Thanks.
Well, there are big questions tonight about one of the vaccines Canada has pre-ordered, the AstraZeneca vaccine out of the UK. Now, earlier this week, it released results showing it's up to 90% effective. That was among people whose first vaccine dose was actually just a half dose. But turns out they were only given a half dose in error, a manufacturing mistake, and then, ironically, it turned out to be the most effective dose. AstraZeneca says it'll likely need to run another global trial to reassess, but the company's also been criticized for not being more forthcoming about its findings and errors. Okay, so let's bring in infectious diseases specialist Dr. Isaac Bogosh to talk this through. Dr. Bogosh, my question is this. Is this a useful mistake, emphasis on the first part, or does the mistake make you think, like, what else don't we know about this? How do you read this situation?
Yeah, it's just an unfortunate situation. It's a pretty impressive gaffe by the company that should have known better. We really need all the trust and public trust we could get right now. And you'd think that there would be a little bit more transparency and honesty in the reporting. Having said that, I mean, even if we take the limited bits of data that we have at face value, they're still really good. I mean, it still may pan out to be a very successful vaccine. It would just have been nice to know that the reporting could have been a little more smooth and honest.
And the criticism about that, I mean, the patchwork way in which they kind of disclose the exact nature of their findings. I mean, we've always been cautious about science by press release, but what are the issues in your mind and sort of the bottom line when it comes to safety for Canadians?
At the end of the day, if a vaccine is going to be rolled out in Canada, Health Canada is going to have to see all of the data. And quite frankly, the company will have to release all of the data to Health Canada so they can assess the safety profile, the efficacy, and Health Canada will pour over that and basically give it the thumbs up or the thumbs down based on what they see. The other thing that's likely going to happen is this will very likely be published in the peer-reviewed medical literature, so the medical scientific community can look at it as well.
Isaac Bogosh, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Ontario released a COVID modeling update today, calling the situation precarious. Officials say growth is slowing, but they warn that demand for intensive care beds is not.
you're still going to see ICU occupancy stay above 200 beds, at least until the end of December. And that's a challenge because that is above the threshold now.
So Ontario said filling 150 ICU beds was the limit before other medical procedures would start to be cancelled. These projections offer a bit of a rosier outlook than the last models. Now a plateau of daily case numbers is anticipated instead of 6,000 a day. Today's new infection count, just under 1,500. Peel region is the worst hit region in Ontario today. A new daily record there, 572 cases. The region joined Toronto in lockdown this week. So what is it about this area that makes it so vulnerable? Christine Birak takes a look.
Every plane flying into Toronto's busiest airport actually lands in the region of Peel. It's one of Canada's largest transportation hubs. Peel is diverse, and some are blaming Black and Indo-Canadian residents for high COVID numbers. Others argue this outbreak has been fueled by workplaces.
I was a professor in India. Now I'm driving a truck.
Balraj Kalan lives in Brampton, Ontario. He hauls Canadian goods into the U.S. Midwest 3 times a week.
When I come back from work, I don't touch anything. Even my clothes are separate.
It's not easy, but he's not alone. Census data shows over 40,000 Brampton residents work in transportation and warehousing. That's nearly triple the number of similar workers in Hamilton.
I think, if anything,
Peel's chief medical officer says in total, there have been over 120 workplace outbreaks.
Truck drivers, food processing workers, pharmaceutical workers, medical workers, these are essential jobs where people can't mail it in.
Warehouse work often brings people in close contact. Amazon's National Distribution Center is in Brampton, running shifts 24/7. While provinces are refusing to name workplaces with outbreaks, Brampton's only hospital is seeing the spread firsthand.
We're seeing people who are essential workers who come home and then, become positive along with the rest of their family.
Most Indo-Canadian families live in multi-generational households, which often include grandparents and other relatives.
You feel very responsible.
Surgeon Savtaj Brar says that's how he grew up. And instead of appreciating the risk workers are taking on, they're facing a torrent of racist stereotypes.
It's not just my parents' neighborhood, it's neighborhoods and communities across the country.
And frankly,
Brampton's mayor adds Ontario has been slow to offer any real support, including paid sick days.
Well, I think the question Canadians need to ask themselves is, if you want Peel Region and Brampton down to single digits, are you willing to give up using Amazon for a month?
Kalan isn't looking for gratitude. He says his most important job is keeping his family safe. Christine Birak, CBC News, Brampton, Ontario.
So in those large multi-generational households, isolating the sick can really be a challenge and a problem long flagged by local politicians. Well, today, federal public health officials announced some help on that front, $6.7 million for a 40-bed isolation center to keep people away from their families after a positive test.
Meanwhile, a chaotic scene played out in Toronto's West End today. Toronto police swarmed by an angry crowd as they arrested the owner of a barbecue restaurant who opened up for a third straight day in defiance of a lockdown.
We understand their frustration, but at the end of the day, the police are in a position to enforce the laws that have been enacted by the province, and that is what we intend to do.
The restaurant owner, Adam Skelly, now faces 13 charges, and a second man was arrested and charged for spitting at officers.
In Quebec, the premier is warning that Christmas is on the line. The province said people could gather over the holidays as long as they isolated before and after. But today, another record jump in cases.
We also need to keep the pandemic under control until Christmas. If our numbers increase too much, we won't allow gatherings.
Quebec reported more than 1,400 new infections. That is a new single-day record, along with 32 more deaths.
Well, Canada's Atlantic bubble basically popped today as New Brunswick became the latest to pull out.
Effective midnight tonight, we're resorting back to our original 14 days isolation for anyone from anywhere traveling into New Brunswick.
This comes as the province reported 12 new cases today. 3 were in the Fredericton region, which will see some restrictions reintroduced tomorrow, including mandatory masks in both indoor and outdoor public spaces.
A disturbing story unfolded in Ontario's cottage country today. It started with an emergency call. It ended with several people seriously hurt and the death of a one-year-old boy. Here's Magda Gabrisalasa on what happened.
Outside this home, signs that a child lived here and signs of a crime. Police say a 33-year-old father abducted his son from this home early this morning. The call coming in as a domestic dispute involving a firearm. It all started in Bobcaygeon and ended about 30 minutes away. First, police say they tried to stop him and his pickup truck. It all ended with a 3-vehicle crash on Pigeon Lake Road. A police officer standing outside his cruiser was seriously injured. An interaction ensued, and then shots were fired.
3 officers discharged their firearms at the man. The man was struck, and he was airlifted and taken to hospital in grave condition. Inside the vehicle was the man's son, a 1-year-old boy, and he was fatally wounded.
She says he had a gunshot wound. Identities of all involved have not been released. As for the wounded officer,
the latest I have heard that the officer is stabilized and, although serious, certainly will hopefully recover.
the Special Investigations Unit is leading the investigation. This is protocol when there is a death or serious injury during a police incident.
It's too early for us to know why officers fired at the vehicle, and it's too early for us to know what exactly transpired, and that's what our investigation will determine.
This is a large crime scene, and as you can see behind me, it remains blocked off. The SIU has several investigators on this and is asking anyone with information to come forward. Magda Gabrisalasa, CBC News, Kawartha Lakes, Ontario.
A Quebec court ruling today could affect mass murder cases across Canada. Judges have reduced the sentence of the man who shot 6 people dead in a Quebec City mosque. Here's Alison Northcott on the decision and its potential fallout.
La douleur du 29 janvier 2017.
The former president of the Quebec City Mosque says the families of the 6 men killed there are trying to rebuild their lives, but today's decision forces them to relive their pain.
Convaincu qu'elle n'est pas dissuasif.
We're convinced this is not dissuasive, says Boufelja Ben Abdallah. That's what hurts us. Alexandre Bissonnette was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 40 years after pleading guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder and 6 of attempted murder. Today, the Quebec Court of Appeal reduced that sentence, saying the provision in the law that allows judges to stack periods of parole ineligibility longer than 25 years is unconstitutional and invalid.
Denying him that right amounts to a cruel and unusual punishment. So it's a very big decision.
This criminal lawyer says it means Bissonnette's life sentence remains, but he can now apply for parole in 25 years.
Doesn't mean he's going to automatically get parole, but at least have a chance to ask for it.
The change in the law only applies to Quebec, but legal experts expect the ruling to be appealed and the debate to land at the Supreme Court.
We will take the necessary time to properly study that decision.
It raises questions around other multiple murder cases, including Justin Bourque, sentenced to life in prison with no parole for 75 years for killing 3 RCMP officers and wounding 2 others in New Brunswick. The lawyer who represented him said this could potentially have implications for his former client.
I would think that if the Supreme Court of Canada upholds the Court of Appeal of Quebec, then he would have an opportunity for an earlier parole application.
In a statement, Bissonnette's lawyers called it a major decision for the respect of human rights in Quebec and Canada. The federal justice minister said it raises important questions and he'll take time to examine it. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
There is some late-breaking news from the United States tonight. President Donald Trump says he will leave the White House if President-elect Joe Biden is certified by the Electoral College.
Certainly I will. Certainly I will. And you know that. But I think that there will be a lot of things happening between now and the 20th of January. A lot of things.
Speaking to reporters on the Thanksgiving holiday, his first time taking questions since election night, Trump still refused to actually concede and declined to say whether he would attend Biden's inauguration.
Well, Toronto police officers speaking out about what she says she faced for years behind the scenes.
He hit me in the chest really hard.
Next, allegations of misogyny, violence, and racism inside the police service.
And later, COVID innovations to help small businesses survive.
You could see tears in some of our vendors' eyes.
Plus, Santa's pandemic plan.
I wear a mask and I wear gloves, and Santa changes his gloves regularly.
Reimagining Christmas traditions. We're back in 2.
Welcome back. We have another story for you about what women can face when they sign up to serve in this country. Tonight, 2 Toronto police officers who have filed human rights complaints speak out to the Fifth Estate's Judy Trin. And we should tell you, the story includes racist and sexist images that female officers say they encountered while working inside Canada's largest municipal police force.
A growing number of female officers are refusing to stay silent about sexual violence within policing. In September, some even took their message to the skies. Daria, a Toronto policewoman, is the latest to join their ranks.
In my rookie night, a bunch of them are sitting on the table and they're drunk. They go, "Take your shirt off, start singing."
CBC is not using Daria's real name because she fears a backlash. In her Ontario human rights complaint, Daria claims she was punched by her partner after trying to stop him from hurting a black suspect.
I asked him to stop. He hit me in the chest really hard, that I end up having injuries.
Daria says she faced reprisals after reporting him. Other officers called her a rat. Her car was keyed. A bag of feces was left on her windshield.
If you're not white, doesn't matter where you're a citizen or you're an employee, you don't have any right.
So what you're looking at are photos of pornography magazines. These magazines are in my workplace.
Effie Zarabi Madge knows what Daria is going through. This constable filed her human rights complaint against Toronto police in 2018.
The environment is so toxic, you're just constantly trying to survive. You can't thrive.
She knows it could be years before she gets a hearing, but Zarabi Madge is using social media to advocate for change now. She's posting photos and texts shared from a private police chat group, revealing racist and sexist behavior.
If you behave like this with your own colleagues, then do you turn it off when you go out and police the public?
Right now, more than 40 Toronto police officers are under investigation for sexual violence. 7 officers have been suspended with pay. In a statement, Chief James Raymer said he's committed to ending the misconduct. He has a personal stake in the matter. His daughter just joined the force. Judy Trin, CBC News, Toronto.
Now, CBC News also spoke with two men who have decided to go public after dealing with systemic racism for years while working in Canada's oil sands. They shared their stories with Asha Tomlinson in the first part of a Marketplace series called Face Racism.
My man.
Shane McQueen and Gary Similian have spent years working in Alberta's oil sands. They started out with great expectations, but what they didn't expect was to be constantly singled out, they say, for being black.
Did you guys feel like you were treated differently?
Oh, in my case, big time.
Similian recalls an experience last year with a former co-worker at the company Badger Daylighting.
Many times he said to me, man, Gary, I can basically slap the black out of you, but just on a jokingly way.
Similian says he didn't report the issue because the co-worker was well connected within the company. And Badger says their code of conduct prohibits them from commenting. McQueen says he's been the target of racist jokes too, but his bigger concern, he's on contract and he's been trying to get a permanent job.
How many rejection letters have you received through the years?
Like literally, probably about 40, 50.
You just don't complain about things. You're supposed to suck it up.
Professor Sarah Duro says McQueen is not alone. She spent more than a decade researching oil sands workers and says systemic racism is at play in the patch.
You have to work harder to prove yourself. Even if you sort of do get in, you might hit that ceiling, right? That given the old boys network culture there, and it isn't to a great degree an old white boys network, that actually being able to move up is also more difficult.
McQueen is ready for change. He's meeting with Jess Thompson, an executive member of Women Building Futures, an organization that's helped women break into the trades for more than 2 decades.
My goal is to try to see the same type of thing for minorities.
I think that there's a lot of work that can be done there, and having someone like yourself champion that work and partner with community organizations to do it is a wonderful thing.
McQueen says he's hopeful for the future. Asha Tomlinson, CBC News, Toronto.
And you can tune in for the full story tomorrow at 8 p.m. on CBC Television and GEM, 8:30 in Newfoundland.
Ahead tonight, a pandemic-safe approach to some familiar Christmas traditions.
Have you got a high five for Santa? Would you give me a high five?
Santa's plan for a healthy holiday.
Next, though, Rosie's here with At Issue.
Andrew, tonight we are going to talk about the politics around Canada's mass vaccination plan and whether this next step in the pandemic response is becoming too political. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea join me right after the break.
the Prime Minister negotiate deals to put Canada at the back of the line for COVID-19 vaccines?
Canada is the best country positioned with the most doses of vaccine per capita anywhere else in the world.
The question to the Minister is simple. On what exact date will the vaccine for Canadians be here?
The member opposite is trying to confuse Canadians right now as we speak.
Canada's vaccine rollout plan continued to dominate much of the conversation here in Ottawa, with some worried the country is falling behind. But is this part of the pandemic response becoming perhaps overly political? And what are the risks for the government and the opposition? It's Thursday. I'm here with at issue Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. It wasn't just this, I must say, this week that made me start to think whether it was getting heated politically. It was also events in Alberta with Jason Kenney, events in Ontario with an Auditor General report with Doug Ford. So it seemed like a whole bunch of things were happening. But let's start with the talk around the vaccines and how that unfolded in terms of the push of the opposition parties to try and get dates and the way the government has managed it. Chantal?
I suspect that there was always going to be a day, and Justin Trudeau knew it, when he would have to say what sounds like a no-brainer, i.e. We are buying a lot of vaccine doses, but we don't produce them. And probably the countries where these vaccines are produced will get first shot at using the vaccines. And why the day came this week, I don't believe is a mistake on the part of the Prime Minister or something he let out that he didn't mean to. Yeah. But the obvious fact that increasingly you would see rollout plans in December in some countries, the US, the UK, for vaccines. And the obvious question, why are we not rolling out vaccines in this country? Yeah. That being said, the reality that vaccines were not going to be rolled out as quickly in countries that don't produce them as versus others that do is not new. And I suspect most premiers actually expected that to be the case, as well as the Prime Minister.
I will say that Erin O'Toole, I mean, is playing fast and loose with the facts in that question there, Andrew, by suggesting that we're going to be last in line. That's not at all what we got from the government today. But give me your thoughts on how it's being handled.
Well, I don't know if we're last in line, but we're certainly behind a lot of other countries, not just the U.S., Germany, and UK, but most of Europe, parts of South America. We are far behind a lot of other countries. And I think it's a perfectly valid question to ask why. I'm not entirely sure I buy the argument that it's just because we don't produce the vaccines here. If you look at the purchasing record of the government, they didn't strike the deals to buy this stuff until August and September, which was several weeks after a lot of other countries. So I think there's more questions to be asked there, whether it's because of that, what exactly is the reason behind it. You can say that's politics and grandstanding. Of course, the opposition is always going to make more of it than needs to be made. I mean, we're going to be somewhat behind the other countries, but we're going to get the vaccines. But I don't think it's an entirely invalid question to look into.
Althea.
What strikes me this week is that the revelation came from the Prime Minister himself. It wasn't that the opposition pressed the government and discovered something at a committee hearing. It is that the Prime Minister himself came out and laid the groundwork to say, listen, I'm tempering expectations here. While you're looking, you watch the news coming from the United States, nobody's going to be vaccinated in December. But it's clear that there was also a kind of wedge politics starting to be played. I think if you're watching Question Period, you feel that the tone and tenure has changed. The Conservatives are much more aggressive. They were going on this line of attack about rapid testing and a lack of at-home tests as being the reason why phase 2 was a lot stronger. The second wave was a lot stronger than the first wave, and blaming the Liberals for this. And the Liberals, basically, Justin Trudeau gave the Conservatives a gift by saying that the vaccines were not going to be coming as early as expected, and they've been running with that. But as they tend to do, they're making the revelation larger than it actually is, where there's enough there to mine. You don't need to exaggerate and say that no one's going to be vaccinated until 2030, which is what Michelle Rempel-Garner said this week in the House of Commons. And we saw the Liberals hide behind the scientists. And this week we had, 3 government experts lay the foundation and say, hey, we're going to be briefing you every week about what the vaccine rollout is going to be.
Yeah, I wondered how much of what the Conservatives were doing this week, Chantal, is actually about what's happening to their friends and cousins in Alberta, in Ontario, where the management of how they've managed the pandemic is under intense scrutiny.
Yes, and premiers of different stripes from the federal government have been setting aside their differences over the course of the pandemic. But the fact that the numbers are going up in places like Alberta and Manitoba, Conservative premiers, Ontario's week was a difficult week. I figure the federal Conservatives are worried or feeling heat from that, as in Conservative premiers, Conservative Party federally. It may not totally reflect, although you did hear premiers expressing some questions and impatience this week, the mood around the First Minister's table, because once you get down to reality, there is no point in bringing morale down by starting to have a pissing contest over why aren't the vaccines in my province on December 15th. So 2 different agendas. Yeah. I think more of an echo from the federal Conservatives than something that is driven by premiers.
Andrew?
I think for anybody who's in government, federal or provincial of whatever party, it is going to be tough sledding over the next weeks and months. The pandemic seems every sign of getting worse. So without blaming the Liberals for that, if you're the federal opposition, you're going to be feeling a little bit more in a place to attack the government. That's just it's just natural and normal that when things are going bad for the government, you're going to be a little bit more on your front foot than you would otherwise be. So I guess I would interpret it that way.
Althea?
Well, I would say we don't know that it's actually bad for the Liberals. I mean, it's sad to say it's bad for the country and it's bad for Canadians, the numbers that we're seeing. But public opinion polls suggest that Liberals are actually having this COVID bump in terms of popularity. They're, the We Charity controversy, they've recovered from that. And I think that is partly, the Conservatives are hoping, the federal Conservatives here are hoping to mine on people's anger about a new lockdown, about more restrictive measures, about the fact that, there's so much more that we know about the virus now that we didn't know in the spring, and now we're questioning authority. And Prime Minister and the Liberals in Ottawa are very aware that they need to kind of separate the levels of responsibility. We saw the Prime Minister this morning on a Calgary radio show kind of explain that's Alberta's responsibility, and our responsibility is to make sure that we send you checks and you can try to survive as best as you can. And I think you're going to see more of that as the situation progresses.
Chantal, you can have 10 seconds. Yeah.
Oh, yes, and before we only accuse the opposition of politicizing this issue, the Prime Minister being on radio in Calgary at the time when Jason Kenney is weak and being criticized, are we not calling that politics too?
Yes, indeed. Good point. All right, thank you all. Appreciate it. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast for extra content. That's where this week we're going to get the panel's take on the upcoming fiscal update.
Our plan will continue to support Canadians through the pandemic and ensure that the post-COVID economy is robust, inclusive, and sustainable.
You can find it on any major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational. The At Issue panel will be back on Monday for the fiscal update. Now, though, back to Andrew and Adrian in Toronto.
All right, next, the growing frustration in the midst of a water crisis. We're on the ground in a deserted Niskantaga First Nation and with evacuees hundreds of kilometers away. A state of emergency after a quarter-century-long drinking water advisory. The people of Nishnawbe First Nation were forced to leave their homes as things got worse. Our Olivia Stefanovic traveled there to see what's left behind and to see the community's fight to go home.
Pleas for help painted on wooden placards greet visitors as soon as they arrive. This is the second time Chief Chris Muniz has returned to the reserve since water quality issues forced his community to evacuate to Thunder Bay last month. The road in passes the cemetery.
You know, we lost so many young people, even the elders that are here that, they never had clean water.
Muniz believes his community's high suicide rate stems from the lack of this basic right.
We were born into to a world where we can't rise because of the issues that we face.
The water treatment plant was built in the early 1990s, but after only 2 years of operation, a boil water advisory was put into effect. Now, 25 years later, the community is still waiting for clean drinking water.
Yeah, there's the water from just before we evacuated, and this is the water, the bottled water. You see the big difference?
Nearly all of Nishnawbe's 300 members left after an oily sheen was detected in the reservoir. Only a few band members remain to keep the homes warm as Canadian Rangers deliver wood and feed the 80 dogs left behind by families now 450 kilometers south. 23-year-old Charla Muniz washes her hands at a hotel without worrying about breaking out into a rash like she does back home.
Here, then there would be like blisters on like parts of the fingers.
Muniz met Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in 2016 to advocate for clean water. She says she left the meeting hopeful that she'd soon be able to drink water from the tap.
Coming out here and seeing how everyone else has it, and like, why can't we have that?
Now, the worry is they will be stuck here for much longer, possibly until the new year.
They may look normal on the outside, but on the inside, where it hurts, you can't see it. You could feel it.
As the holiday season approaches, they're only asking for one gift: to be home with clean water for the first time this century. Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News, Thunder Bay, Ontario.
And we have a lot more ahead tonight, including the moment. A 7-year-old boy gets a moment with his hero, Nova Scotia's Chief Medical Officer of Health.
This year marks the 15th anniversary of the Elf on the Shelf's entrance onto the global stage.
Well, lots of giant balloons, but no crowds at this year's Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, thanks, of course, to the pandemic. That means Black Friday is tomorrow. Now, across this country, there's a push to make sure Canadians don't forget smaller local businesses as they shop for the holidays during the pandemic. Jacqueline Hansen looks at some creative ways they are getting their goods to customers.
Supporting local businesses is Melissa Zucker's Bread and Butter. For 6 years, she organized pop-up food and artisan markets, but the pandemic pushed her marketplace online.
It's innovation that grew from COVID.
The virtual Toronto Market Co. has 90 local vendors on one website.
Really trying to connect our customer with local goods that they may otherwise not know about, or it might be a bit hard to have access to.
Convenience and price are often barriers to shopping local, but in the pandemic, there's a new wave of support.
We're trying to do this in an effort to make a difference, almost as a patriotic duty.
In Winnipeg, restaurant owner and former CFL player Abi Khan launched a virtual marketplace called Good Local.
The response has been insane.
In just 3 weeks, orders skyrocketed from 18 to more than 700.
You could see tears in some of our vendors' eyes that they were saying, I have sold more in 2 weeks than I've sold in the last 9 months since COVID started. Because of you, Abby, we can now pay our mortgage this month.
But Good Local is losing money. It's not charging commission, and its delivery fee is just $5. With plans to expand, it needs funding, IT support, and more space.
I fundamentally believe that's a paradigm shift going forward. People will always want to support local if you can make it easy for them.
Reaching critical mass is key for movements like this to have a real financial impact.
Individual consumers trying to make a difference in our community are going to benefit from that personally by feeling better about ourselves. But economically, things only make a difference if we find a way to scale this up.
704 more to go.
And expanding could be a win-win for small businesses that need more sales and for consumers who may need to feel good right now more than ever. Jacqueline Hansen, CBC News, Toronto.
Another tradition this time of year, a visit with Santa. And this year, the North Pole's jolly old soul is getting creative because he has to. Susanna Da Silva takes a look.
No matter the setup, the goal for kids is always the same, telling Santa what they want for Christmas any way they can.
I'm a baby Yoda. I asked it for a puppy that walks and talks and closes his eyes and goes to sleep and poops and pees. And I smile.
At the West Edmonton Mall, Santa is taking wishes from a distance this year, with spaced out appointments and time in between to Santatize his sleigh.
Just waves from afar. But kids are just excited to be able to see him.
And they hoped the distance from Santa might be a good thing to get a tear-free photo.
You're a big girl now, aren't you?
Santa plans vary at malls across the country. In some, Santa will only be there in spirit. In others, there will be virtual visits and online story times.
What would you like for Christmas?
At this BC mall, Santa helped design his own set with safety in mind. His 24th year on the job, the first behind plexiglass. But new restrictions have put even those plans on hold. Still, whether in person or online, he's ready for new questions from kids this year, like how can Santa deliver gifts to our home safely?
Well, as Bonnie Henry had suggested, that Santa is probably immune from the virus. And of course, elves, they're not humans. They don't have to worry about that at all.
What do you say to a child whose wish is for COVID to go away?
I would say to a child, you have to realize that Santa, in essence, is a toy maker. I can make enough toys for all the boys and girls, and I can get them around the world in one night. However, there are some things I just can't build in a toy shop. But I would say, if you'd like, when I get back to the North Pole tonight, I'll gather all the elves together and Mrs. Claus in our great room, and we'll say a little prayer. You get that wish. Bye-bye.
A wish that is on everyone's Christmas list. Susanna Da Silva, CBC News, Vancouver.
Well, that is adorable. And we've got another good one for you. Next on The National, a visit with a hero. The story behind this meetup and why it mattered so much to both of them. Next in our moment.
11.
For breaking news and COVID-19 updates, CBC News Network is now in free preview. Contact your local television service provider for more information.
Throughout the pandemic, health officials across Canada have become real-life heroes to many kids. The latest, Nova Scotia's Dr. Robert Strang. So a Nova Scotia boy has something in common with the doctor. They were both born with a cleft lip and palate. And when Dr. Strang found out what they share, he planned a little surprise, and that's our moment.
I had sent our neighbor, Dr. John Gillis, a text to say what a wonderful job Dr. Strang had been doing, and it was his hero because he also has a cleft lip and palate, just like Dr. Strang. Within a few hours, he was at the door with a COVID stuffy for Huey, which is just an amazing gesture.
He is very tall, and he uses very kind words.
They had a little discussion about their surgeries, and it was a really, really special moment for him to take that out of his busy schedule to come and do that for Huey. It shows that, you know, even if you have a challenge like this, that you can still achieve great things. Huey's a great boy and will grow up to do great things as well.
Well, and that's something so small can be so special, right? And Huey, apparently on the school bus, all the kids think he's famous. They call him Mr. Famous. They actually even want his autograph.
Perfect. And that stuffy is kind of amazing. I mean, who would have thought a COVID stuffy? Right. And its name is COVID-19. COVID is the first name, 9 is the middle name, and teen is its last name, as you do. That is a national for Thursday, November 26th.
You got it.
Thank you.
Right.